Good morning, everyone. My name is Alan Price. I'm counsel to the CTTF. Today's press conference is on Section 232 and the aluminum industry. Today we are here with a distinguished panel. First, I'd like to welcome former Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich. Mr. Speaker Gingrich will be joining us via video. He was called away at the last minute for urgent business in Rome, so we are thrilled to have Speaker Gingrich here via video. Also joining me today will be Mr. Mike Bless. Mr. Bless is President and CEO of Century Aluminum. Century accounts for a majority of domestic production of primary aluminum. Primary aluminum is the actual raw aluminum product that is produced, that is then finished by others. Following Mr. Bless will be Congressman James Comer. Congressman Comer represents primary aluminum production at a plant in Seabury, Kentucky. We're thrilled to have Congressman Comer with us today to talk about the importance of 232 relief to the domestic industry. We will also be joined today by Mr. Tom Conway, the International Vice President for the United Steelworkers of America. Mr. Conway will talk about the importance of comprehensive relief for the aluminum industry and how it's important to the workers to obtain meaningful and effective relief. Our final speaker will be General James Adams. General Adams was the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency and has written extensively on defense vulnerabilities to the U.S. industrial base. Following brief remarks, we will open the floor to questions from members of the media, and we will be happy to entertain some questions. With that, I'd like to introduce our first panelist, Speaker Newt Gingrich. And Mr. Gingrich, the floor is yours, and we're pleased to have you joining us today. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and thank you for allowing me to appear by satellite. I think this is a very important topic, not just for the aluminum industry, but for the whole industrial base and the whole way that we approach trade. I think it's very significant that one of the major themes in the Trump presidential campaign was that the United States was not doing well in international trade negotiations, that we weren't tough enough, we weren't smart enough. And I think now that they're in office, they're beginning to get a better sense of how complicated and how challenging this is. And I want to focus particularly on the impact of the Chinese, who are by far the dominant figures in creating an overproduction of aluminum, and doing so in a way which would be economically irrational if you saw it in a worldwide market, but which, given their willingness to subsidize jobs, makes sense for them, even though it then crowds out other countries and creates real concerns. And I want to emphasize two thematics about this that may be a little different than people are used to. The first is, you can't just look at Chinese behavior in China. You have to look at what they're doing all around the world, everything from buying up bauxite supplies, and by the way, in some other industries, there's a very methodical effort to corner the market in rare earths and in rare minerals in ways that could give them enormous advantage, both in batteries, for example, and in solar power. And it's a very methodical, very well thought out program that they actually released a pretty long paper on in 2015, outlining their strategy for economic growth. And it fits what President Xi said at the Party Congress in his 3.5-hour acceptance speech, where he said by 2049, the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party taking over Beijing, it is his hope that they will be a hegemon and that they will have surpassed the United States. And they have a lot of very methodical efforts underway. So there are two parts to what I want to emphasize in starting this conversation, and I know that you have some genuine experts there who can expand on this and put it in a more immediate context. The first is that we have to develop an ability to, in particular dealing with China, which is the only real competitive potential hegemon that we're going to compete with. The Russians are much too small. The Indians are not at nearly the state of development the Chinese are. But the Chinese are going to be competitors all over the world, and they're actively engaged in trying to find ways to dominate the market. And that means that they very often do very clever things. But we shouldn't regard it as cheating. The Chinese are going to take advantage of every break they can get. And frankly, they look at it as our problem. And Trump has said this. President Trump has indicated several times that if the other side is a better negotiator, if they're more clever, if they find better loopholes, I mean, it's not their fault. They're behaving competitively. The challenge for us is to be able to match them and be able to defend ourselves, defend our interests, and know what we're doing. So I think part of my focus would be on looking at the impact of Chinese overproduction, not just on the U.S., but frankly on the entire world aluminum system. The second point I'd make is that we're going to have to rethink how we apply these various sanctions. They've got to become faster. They've got to be more targeted. They've got to be more decisive. And what's happened with us, as you all know better than I do, for example, with the World Trade Organization, the Obama administration filed a complaint in the last weeks it was in office, and it just languishes in Geneva. There's no energy, there's no drive, there's no push, there's no deadline. And so I was a supporter both of NAFTA and of the World Trade Organization. But as I look back on it, what I didn't understand was that if, particularly with the WTO, there's a presumption that the other side will play by the rules. Now, if they're not going to play by the rules, you have to be correspondingly more aggressive at each stage of the game in order to figure out how to guarantee that you have. I don't mind fair competition, but if we set up competition that is going to kill American jobs, destroy the American aluminum industry, cripple American steel, basically wipe out solar power production in the United States so it all becomes imported. When you go down this list, you begin to realize that's, from a national security standpoint, very dangerous, which is why, by the way, the National Security Strategy paper, which was released a few weeks ago, has a very strong section on economics, on the industrial base, on the need for us to confront how much we have to rethink the way we're approaching trade and the way we're approaching enforcement of trade agreements. The last thing I would say is it may also mean that Congress has got to play a real role in sharpening the president's choices. There may be circumstances where the president wants to, for example, raise a levy across the board on everybody. There may be other circumstances where we want to target specific countries because of what they're doing. The Chinese are clearly, overwhelmingly, the primary problem in basic aluminum production. And we need to have tools that the President and the Secretary of Commerce can use that are timely, are efficient, and are targeted. And to the degree that we currently don't have the right laws, we need to have serious hearings and rewrite the legislation to strengthen our hands. I know you're going to take this and look, and there's a number of specific examples here, and you have several real experts on the panel. I personally look forward to listening to them and then to being part of taking questions and being involved. This is the beginning of a period of rethinking what we're doing. The Trump administration's direction, I think, is largely correct, but it's going to have to go through a lot of learning in order to be effective, and we're going to have to be willing to be flexible in how we rethink the laws and how we use the laws to make sure that we're protecting both our industrial base and American jobs across the board. So I'd like to yield back for right now, but I will be here. I want to be part of the Q&A session at the end. I very much look forward to what I think is a very high value, very informed panel, and I'm honored that you allowed me to be part of it.
Mike Bless, President and CEO of Century Aluminum.
Thanks, Alan, very much. And thank you very much to Speaker Gingrich for his excellent and timely remarks. We're very appreciative. Good morning. As Alan said, I'm Mike Bless, President and CEO of Century Aluminum Company. The President's decision in this 232 investigation is critical to the continued viability of this industry in the United States and its ability, importantly, to support our national defense. My 1,800 colleagues at Century and I believe the President should take robust, comprehensive action to adjust imports to allow U.S. production to restart. Let me put this bluntly. The U.S. aluminum industry from top to bottom faces a historic crisis and may not survive much longer if we don't act. Global overcapacity and a flood of imports have chipped away at this industry for nearly 2 decades, as those of you know who follow this sector. In 2000, this country had 23 primary aluminum smelters and was one of the largest producers in the world. Today, only 5 of those plants remain, and only 2 of these are running at capacity. We are the only remaining producer of high-purity aluminum. That product is used in defense platforms including F-35, F-18, and F-16 fighter jets and other military aircraft, littoral combat ships, armored tanks for the LTV program, tank hulls, missile structures, and other such products. This could be our best and last opportunity to ensure this industry is here tomorrow for our men and women in uniform and for the communities that depend on the good jobs the industry supports. Importantly, we believe there are a bunch of misunderstandings about this investigation that have turned it into a more controversial decision than it should be, and I'd like to discuss these quickly. The first is that any response might be aimed at the wrong targets. For example, if Chinese subsidization, as Speaker Gingrich referenced, is the biggest cause of the problem, then shouldn't relief be limited to China alone? While Chinese subsidization is a significant contributor to the aluminum excess capacity crisis, it is in fact only part of the problem. What is less apparent and less understood is that even outside of China, the role of governments has expanded as private smelters have borne the brunt of the damage. As private smelters in the US and other places have been unable to compete with the Chinese government have shut down, state-owned smelters around the world have survived and expanded. In the Middle East, state-owned entities, for example, account for 98% of smelting capacity. Elsewhere in Asia, including importantly in India, and in Central and South America, it's nearly half. Even in Europe, state-owned smelters account for more than 20% of capacity. By contrast, no North American smelting capacity is state-owned. Market-based players in the US have been forced to shut down, despite our country being amongst the lowest cost producers in the world. This should be a boom period for the US industry. We have the safest, most productive, and well-trained labor force in the world. The statistics bear that out. At the same time, as a result of falling energy prices, US power costs, as many of you know, power is the most important input to making aluminum, primary aluminum. Our costs here are either better than or on par with most other aluminum producing regions. Despite these important advantages, since 2003, the US industry has lost nearly 70% of its productive capacity. This development, which should never have happened, has directly cost over 8,000 production workers their good paying jobs. State ownership and support outside the US, however, has frustrated our ability to benefit from these falling energy prices in our country. At the same time, these practices have maintained and increased capacity in other parts of the world. Rather than allowing market forces to guide the expansion or contraction of the industry, governments, including China and others, prop up their smelters with a variety of illegal subsidies, from inputs to financing. These subsidies have caused capacity both inside and outside China to continue expanding at the expense of market-based players in the US. For example, in the Middle East, production has expanded by 30% from 2013 to 17. In India, it's over 95% in the same period. And even in the EU, production is up by 15%. This expansion has driven a collapse in global prices, forced US producers to idle their facilities, and flooded the US with imports, all with drastic consequences. The industry's collapse here in the US under the pressure of state-supported overcapacity has been so severe that we cannot guarantee we'll be able to supply the needs of the US military going forward. China may be the biggest cause of this crisis, but it's not the only problem, as I've said. Given our excellent labor force and highly competitive energy costs, the US industry is able to compete with any producer in the world on equal terms. It can't compete, however, against state government interventions around the world, tilting the scales and distorting market dynamics. This is precisely why a comprehensive, robust response by the President is needed to stem the growth and distortive effects of state-owned smelters in China and elsewhere. The second misunderstanding is that a comprehensive response would be harmful to the American economy, including downstream manufacturers in the aluminum industry. To be clear, we see this as an industry-wide problem, and we are not advocating for a response that would shut imports out of this country. Our own health, for example, depends on the vitality of the rollers, extruders, and other manufacturers that are our biggest customers. The goal of any solution is simply to ensure a safe and secure supply of aluminum into the United States by returning the industry to a sustainable footing. between imports and the amount of U.S. capacity that would be able to return to the market in a sustainable environment and that's ready to restart, supply would be sufficient to meet market demands. With respect to a response on the broader economy, the ITC examined the economy-wide effects of a similar response in the 2001 Steel Safeguards investigation. It concluded that tariffs on steel imports resulted in negligible effects on the overall GDP of our country. For both metals, the broader economic impact is negligible. This is a small price to pay for a safe and stable supply of a product that is critical to the U.S. national defense and economy. In summary, we believe the best way forward for the whole industry and for the country is clear. We need to recognize that state support and intervention around the globe has precipitated the excess capacity crisis that is devastating the U.S. primary aluminum industry and threatening its ability to ensure supply for national defense and other critical applications. The President cited this type of economic aggression in his national security and strategy speech during his recent trip in Asia. This is the very problem facing the U.S. primary aluminum industry. It demands a comprehensive response to adjust imports and allow U.S. production to restart. A comprehensive response is not only the best way to safeguard U.S. national security, it's the best way to motivate action towards the longer-term goal of bringing the market back into balance and long-term sustainability. Over the last year, thanks to President Trump's leadership, we've seen U.S. action followed by responses elsewhere that had meaningful effects on the market. After the President initiated the Section 232 investigation, China announced capacity cuts that led to increases in global prices. We hope that the President's leadership on this issue continues and that comprehensive relief for this industry can ensure these improvements are permanent. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I would now like to introduce Congressman Comer for our next set of remarks.
Well, thank you all for being here. Speaker Gingrich, it's an honor to share the stage with you. Appreciate your leadership in the past. Let me begin by saying, as a former Kentucky statewide elected official and former six-term Kentucky state representative, I can say with confidence there's not a better corporate citizen in the entire Commonwealth of Kentucky than Century Aluminum. In my district, just to kind of put that into perspective, it's about a 6-hour drive from the eastern part of my district to the western part of my district. It spans from eastern Kentucky all the way to western Kentucky along the Tennessee border, and that includes 35 counties, 35 out of Kentucky's 120 counties. There's not an employer in the 1st Congressional District of Kentucky that comes anywhere near paying the average salary that Century Aluminum pays its workforce. So just to put this into perspective, this is one of the most important, if not the most important employer in my congressional district. And in my congressional district, as I have said to President Trump every time that we've had a conversation, you would be hard-pressed to find a congressional district out of the 435 districts across America where the president has a higher approval rating or where the president performed better in the last presidential election. And one reason that the president performed so well in my congressional district is we've seen devastating job losses throughout the district over the past 2 decades, especially in manufacturing. So what we have with Century Aluminum is a tremendous corporate citizen that pays their workers the highest wages of any employer in my congressional district. And from a workforce safety standpoint, I believe the plant in Seabury, Kentucky, which I represent, has the best track record with respect to having no or very few injuries in the workplace. So we're very pleased to have Century Aluminum in the 1st Congressional District of Kentucky. They have another plant in the 2nd Congressional District as well. But today I'm calling on President Trump to take the facts from his investigation from Section 232 and act. We have an industry, a vital industry to Kentucky, to America, that is being put at an unfair competitive advantage based on unfair trade practices that China is doing. And this was one of the major themes, as Speaker Gingrich said, in the president's election, and this is one of the overarching themes that provided the president such a huge margin of victory, 50-point margin of victory in my congressional district. So I'm calling on the President today to take swift, immediate action based on the results that they've had from this investigation over the past few months, and help to protect not only an industry that pays tremendous wages to its workers, but also take action for an industry that's important to our national security. As the President and CEO mentioned earlier, this is a plant that produces important products for our United States military, not just in our fighter jets, but also in our vehicles that transport our soldiers that are in direct line of roadside bombs and other perils that have caused so many injuries and deaths to our troops. So today, hopefully, the President will begin to take action and help this industry be able to compete. All we're asking for is a level playing field. We're not asking for any types of subsidies or benefits. We just want a level playing field. And I think if we have a level playing field, Century Aluminum's plants in Kentucky can compete against any plant in the world. Thank you.
Thank you. We appreciate those remarks. And now to talk further about concerns of workers in this matter, I have the pleasure of introducing Tom Conway, Vice President from the United Steelworkers.
All right, thanks. Appreciate everybody taking time to come out today. My name's Tom Conway. I'm the International Vice President of the Steelworkers Union, and I lead the union's collective bargaining efforts in the aluminum and other industries, so I'm pleased to get the recognition from the wage package from the congressman at Century. We have a good relationship with Century and a good partnership on these issues. Steelworkers is the largest industrial manufacturing union in North America, and our membership spans sectors in all the metals: aluminum, steel, titanium, copper, others, and extends into mining and the broader manufacturing, such as rubber, glass, paper, and then final products like the carrier furnaces that got so much attention earlier. We've also members in healthcare, transportation, and the public sector, and so we see a lot of trade issues. We've been on the front line of trade battles against unfair and predatory foreign trade practice for a long time. Our union has. We've participated in more trade cases than any other single entity, and we've carried the brunt and the burden of the job losses of those cases, filing case after case, demanding action as our members are paying the price of this unfair trade through the loss of their jobs. And trade cases aren't something we're anxious to file. We'd vastly prefer we have trade policies that work to support fair trade, and that our government step in when others don't play by the rules. By the time a trade case makes its way through the process, we've lost already. We've lost the jobs, people have lost their homes, they've lost their cars, they can't make tuition payments for their kids. The current process we have just doesn't work, and by the time a company can get around to make that fight and the workers can help make that fight, it's lost. And so we need something else. Something's got to change. The deck is stacked against us. Our companies aren't competing against companies. They're competing against other nations and countries, and the impact has been devastating. Aluminum's a critical material, from missile skins to airframes to critical infrastructure, such as our electrical grid. Aluminum's unique properties and the use of that support our national security and our further economic security. And while a lot of this discussion today is about national defense, you're going to need an underpinning in those businesses that's broader across the entire aluminum sector. And that's why we think this 232 needs to have a broad approach. Since 2000, we've gone from 23 smelters in America to only 5 today. And those 5 are they're not operating at their full capacity. Only 2 of them are operating at the capacity. And over the same period, since 2003, our country has lost 8,000 jobs in the aluminum sector alone. That's a loss of about 75% of the workforce. And during that period of time, China has added 65,000 jobs into the global industry, and the Middle East is increased by 9,000 and India by 6,000. And the growth and overcapacity about what the global market needs is just set a price and cause the shutdown of American jobs at the expense of the Chinese. The Chinese producers are largely state-owned, and the same is true in the Middle East. In India and otherwise, roughly half of the production is supported by the state. And the problem here is global overcapacity. It's fueled by state-supported production. China is the principal problem, but far from the only one. In other sectors, we've used some of the tools available. There's primarily anti-dumping, countervailing duty cases, and there are orders in place on extruded products and aluminum, which our members also produce. We supported efforts on aluminum foil, and most recently the administration's self-initiation of a case on common ally sheet, and we also support that. And they're important, but they don't get to the root of the problem. Aluminum's traded differently. The price is set globally. It's the overcapacity has made it impossible for companies here to survive, not because they're more efficient elsewhere or make a better product. It's just that the pricing the way it's done here, and with this capacity and the predatory pricing, just makes it almost impossible to do business this way any longer. So addressing over global capacity through negotiations, it's been an empty effort. It's been tried. The idea, it's gone on for 30 years in some places, that we're going to sit and talk and have a global dialogue, and someone is going to say, okay, I'll shut mine down. It doesn't work. It's unfeasible, and frankly, it doesn't make sense. So calling for global negotiations, we really need a hard and fast action. And when the president called for action on 232, we supported that, and we've been engaged in broad efforts to get prompt attention and action. Our members are demanding action, constantly petitioning Department of Commerce and the White House, and we've had a good response from many members of Congress. The administration promised there'd be action and that it would be quick. And it's 9 months later, and we're still waiting, and it continues to drag on. And the deadline for the Department of Commerce for that report, it's approaching quickly. And our members can't understand why the promises that were made are still unfulfilled. And they were told that this was a crisis, and our national security was in jeopardy, and their jobs remain in jeopardy. And then they told the action would have to wait until health care was done, and then wait again until a tax package was done. And while they're waiting, they're continuing to struggle. And so Congress finally passes a tax bill for a bunch of rich people and corporations while we're still waiting for that promise to be fulfilled. So this deadline's near. The administration has to act to preserve and protect our national security and not abandon the workers who they've made promises to. And he needs to live up to his campaign promises. Workers are waiting for action on aluminum, on steel, on infrastructure, on cutting the trade deficit, on NAFTA renegotiation. You know, there'll be a lot of figures that people will go through, and there's a lot of industries who are saying, well, if you do something, if you put a tariff on aluminum, it's going to cost us downstream. Look, those downstream manufacturers, the beverage industry has weighed into this and said, well, you're going to drive up the price of our products. You're going to drive up the price of beer. If there were a 20% tariff put on aluminum, it would raise the price of beer by about a half a cent a can, or three pennies for a six-pack. Nobody in America is going to get excited or upset about paying 3 cents more for a six-pack of beer to be able to preserve the businesses and the companies that provide our national security, that provide those jobs, that help grow that economy. And under this recent tax package, those aluminum companies, and comes out of the Joint Committee on the Tax proposal, they're going to get a $4.2 billion tax relief and will complain about a half a penny on a can of beer. And it just becomes a frustrating discussion for us to have to continue to listen to. So promises were made. We're anxious to see what the administration is going to do, if the president is going to follow through on what he promised to do. And our union's not going to sit quietly and wait forever and forever while our jobs are lost. So I appreciate the opportunity for everybody to come and talk and listen to us and deal with an issue that America needs to deal with and has had to deal with for a long time. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd now like to introduce our final speaker, General John Adams. General?
Thank you, sir, for that kind introduction. I have to say I served for more than 30 years on active duty and had the privilege of serving more than 8 years in the Defense Intelligence Agency, but I was not the director, just to keep the record straight. We're here today, Mr. Speaker, distinguished panelists and guests, we're here today to talk about a national security crisis. The growing dependence of the United States on the import of aluminum is something that threatens the core of our defense industrial base and, for the context of this discussion, our aluminum industry. The condition continues to worsen, and all Americans have a stake in addressing this problem urgently and effectively. Let me emphasize 3 key points. First, aluminum is a raw material with critical U.S. national security applications. Primary aluminum and other aluminum products are used in a variety of defense applications, including F-18 and F-35 fighter jets, photos of which I think you all have in your press packets, Army and Marine Corps tactical vehicles, and also Navy and Coast Guard vessels. I myself have fought on battlefields with the protection provided by aluminum in armored vehicles, particularly the Bradley fighting vehicle. I myself, as an Army aviator in the 1980s, flew aircraft where the aluminum in the wing spars provided the necessary strength for my aircraft's performance in high-stress maneuvers. So I know from personal experience how valuable aluminum is. I also can tell you that when I was flying my airplane, I wasn't thinking much about where the aluminum came from, but I should have been, because our aluminum is made, now aluminum that we put into our aircraft is high-purity aluminum, and it is made to exacting military specifications. We also can depend on the supply chain of that aluminum. We know that we can rely on that in a crisis. And what's at issue here, what's at stake for all of us, is that our warriors today need to continue to have faith that the aluminum that's made for their fighting vehicles, for their ships, and for their aircraft is made to exacting military specifications, is thoroughly tested and vetted, that we know what the supply chain is, and more important, we know where the supply chain is reliable or not. And that is a major concern to me as a soldier. National security, however, means more than just the military hardware used in battle. Any discussion of national security also has to include critical infrastructure. Aluminum is used in numerous applications, including bridges and highways, buildings, and other construction. Aluminum is widely used in electrical grids, which is in the event of war, that's one of the first things we can expect to suffer damage. Damage to this infrastructure is likely, which would only increase our demand and reinforce the importance of ensuring we have an adequate domestic supply. Given the dramatic declines in U.S. primary aluminum capacity and production, the vast majority of primary aluminum is now produced by foreign countries. Most of the imports from China, Russia, India, and the Middle East and elsewhere is of this critical input. These are hostile sources of supply, but at the least, they're very unstable sources of supply. Second, our aluminum industry is under attack by those who do not share our interests and deliberately undercut our industry by dumping overcapacity on the global market. Our economic strength depends on free and fair trade, where we work on the same playing field. And our aluminum producers operate according to market rules. Our producers must remain profitable in order to survive. And by contrast, state-owned and state-directed aluminum producers outside the United States rely on government subsidies and can afford to operate unprofitably. As a case in point, our aluminum smelters' largest external costs are for electricity that they pay market rates for. However, aluminum producers in much of the rest of the world benefit from free or low-cost electricity subsidies. These allow them to produce at vastly lower prices than our producers must charge in order to remain profitable. And they also benefit from highly subsidized state-directed financing that helps these producers maintain and expand their capacity. As a retired intelligence professional, I know there is no greater threat to our national security than the Chinese and other governments' determination to cripple our defense industrial base. In this context, our vital aluminum industry. Since 2009, the actions of governments both inside and outside of China have caused a massive expansion of capacity in state-owned and directed aluminum producers around the world. Make no mistake, as the speaker said, the Chinese aim at domination of global markets. They're competing directly with our economy, and they're competing directly with our economy to undercut our defense industrial base. We must not abet China by remaining complacent in the face of this attack. Lastly, we can and must act urgently to enable our aluminum industry to survive. The Secretary of Commerce soon will complete the Section 232 investigation. The President will determine appropriate relief measures within the subsequent 90 days. And we need broad relief measures that do the following. First, yield a meaningful opportunity for our U.S. aluminum producers to recapture lost market share and rebuild their broken supply chains. Second, we have to restrict aluminum imports across the board, with limited exceptions for allies such as Canada, with whom our aluminum industry is synergistically linked. And we should structure these measures to allow our producers to restore 100% of the remaining U.S. aluminum production. The U.S. and Canadian industries can satisfy virtually 100% of U.S. demand for aluminum. We must provide relief for the entire aluminum supply chain in the United States, from smelting to the production of finished products. The U.S. industry must remain healthy throughout the production chain by incentivizing production. And finally, we must proactively apply our trade enforcement laws to provide relief from market distortions before plants are forced to close and capacity is irreparably lost. In conclusion, our aluminum smelting capacity is fragile. Once it's lost, it's difficult, if not impossible, to restore. If we put a potline on idle, it takes literally years and tens of millions of dollars to reopen and put it back online. The longer we delay relief measures, the greater likelihood of layoffs, the greater likelihood of already stressed aluminum producers shutting potlines, and perhaps most important, we'll lose the skilled workers that make the aluminum in America. We must complete this 232 investigation and impose relief urgently. Our warriors and the American people deserve better. Thank you.
Thank you, General. We appreciate those remarks. I'd like to just kick it off with a few questions before we open it up to the press. A bit of a discussion here. Speaker Gingrich, in announcing the Section 232, President Trump pointed to the collapse of primary aluminum smelting as a principal reason for initiating the 232, and in fact pointed to the fact that 8 smelters had shut and only 2 were left operating at full capacity. Looking at this from a national security perspective, why do you think aluminum is important to national security and strategically important that the U.S. make primary aluminum?
Well, look, the easiest answer is just to rely on, you just had a general officer who has background in the Defense Intelligence Agency who himself has been a helicopter pilot. We have seen a hollowing out of our industrial base as it relates to our capacity to defend ourselves across the board. Aluminum as an example, but frankly, the degree to which we now rely on foreign manufacturers for chips means that almost all of our processing capabilities have some very real vulnerabilities. So I see the aluminum case as this is why I mentioned the national security strategy, which had been released a few weeks ago. The aluminum case is one of the building blocks that are absolutely central. If you sit down and say, what would America need to prosecute a significant war, you're going to find that aluminum comes up as a major component. And again, without being too repetitive, but when you look at the F-35, the F-18, you look at next generation fighting vehicles, the range of places where we use aluminum is very substantial, has grown a great deal over the last 40 years. And aluminum has become one of the central materials in certain levels of defense activities. So from my perspective, at a national security level, and you have to do this, I think, across the board, we desperately need a much more aggressive review of our entire industrial base And this particular case is a good place for the administration to put a strong stamp on it. And let me pick up on something that the Vice President for the Steelworkers said. Action which is delayed, in effect, is deadly. We have got to get much more agile at looking at a case, making a decision, implementing the decision, and then if our competitor gets clever, we got to come back in a cycle time that's very fast in holding them to what we're trying to accomplish. And I would hope that you're going to see the Department of Commerce recommendation not languish in the White House for weeks and weeks and weeks, but a pretty fast turnaround between the initial recommendation and actual implementation by the President.
For those remarks, General.
Sir, if I may follow up on your remarks, the issue of where our supply chain runs is critical, and it's something we don't think about as much as we should. For the military, a supply chain that runs to Russia or China is obviously a concern, especially when the material itself is made to military specifications. And that's what we've got here with aluminum. But I would argue on the other side, we can't afford to lose the capacity to make it here in the United States, because it almost doesn't matter where else it's made if we lose that capacity, and we'll lose it forever if we don't act urgently and comprehensively on this issue. Thank you.
Mr. Bliss.
Yeah, thank you, Alan. May I pick up a point made just by the speaker and previously by Mr. Conway and General Adams, and that's the timeliness again. This can't be repeated enough because it's critically important here. Some may say that perhaps the priority here is not great, given that the aluminum price, since the President initiated the 232 investigation in April, has come up a little bit, and that in fact is true. The market, that is because absolutely the market is expecting action to come out of this country of a comprehensive nature. But all one has to do is look back at the last downturn in the aluminum price. This is a commodity, so by its nature, it's volatile in its price, and this is amongst the most volatile of the base metals and even of all commodities. In 2015, the U.S. was producing about 2.5 million tons of aluminum, primary aluminum per year. And when the price came down precipitously, 100%, all of that production was at one point in time slated for closure. There was a time in the fall of 2015 when our company and the other primary producers in the U.S. had announced, taken action, that we were going to shut down 100% of the primary aluminum in this country over the space of a couple months. That's how quickly it can happen. Thankfully, we were able to eke out of that with 700,000 tons still running. Next time, those smelters will be gone in the space of a couple months, and this discussion will unfortunately be over. So it's critically important, the speaker's point.
Thank you, and that raises another important question. China accounts for about 50% of primary aluminum production and about 50% of primary steel production. In announcing the Section 232 on steel, the President recognized that while China was a core component, the solution and the problem could not just the solution to this problem was not just China, that the overcapacity problem as existed is global in nature and requires a global solution. So, Mike, do you want to touch on why you think this is more than why there's a need for comprehensive relief and needs to have a more systemic solution?
Sure. When you look at where primary aluminum growth has occurred over the last couple of years, and B, where the imports into the U.S. are coming from, to the destruction almost of this industry, it's from a variety of countries. Most of them, if not all of them, benefit from, as we've discussed, support from various state-owned actors. For example, in China, almost 2/3 of the production there is owned or directly controlled by state-owned actors, and their production is up 45% over the last 4 years. For example, in the Middle East, it's virtually all of their production, and their production is up 30%. One more, India, which is somewhat below half controlled by state-owned actors. Their aluminum sector has grown by 90% over the last 4 years. And lastly, the U.S., of course, totally owned by the market, private investors, like our share owners. Our production is down by 60%. So it's clear absolutely clear what's going on here. And the second part of the answer, Alan, just quickly, and perhaps General Adams wants to touch on this as well, is that when you look at our high purity production, our plant in Hawesville, Kentucky, is the only plant, that's in Representative Comer's district, is the only plant in the United States that can make volume and dependable volume quantities of high purity aluminum for the applications that the General mentioned. That plant now is producing no high purity aluminum because the market here for high purity has been flooded over the last couple of years with imports principally from two regions. The most significant by far is the Persian Gulf, and then second is Russia, which is largely state-controlled as well effectively. So, Alan, the problem is absolutely widespread and global.
General?
All right, thank you for the opportunity. Allow me to mention another dynamic that we haven't discussed very much. In a market economy, any capacity, building a capacity requires continued investment. There has to be R&D, there has to be capital investment in order for the industry to survive. That's what happens in a market economy. That's not what happens in a state-owned economy, in a command economy. So we're already not on a level playing field with companies that produce aluminum in China, for example, because they subsidize the production. They don't require investment in R&D because it's automatic. But our market economy, our producers, our market players have to have investment in order to produce better aluminum in the future, in order to continue to invest in capital. And that is a dynamic that threatens the survival. Again, once we lose it, we've lost it forever. We can't afford to let this moment pass.
So with that, I'd like to open the floor to questions. I'd like to just state that the questions will we'll open the floor to members of the press, and my colleague will be handing out the microphone, and when you have the microphone, please feel free to ask a question, state your name and affiliation.
Hi, I'm Anna Swanson with the New York Times. Thank you for your comments today. I wanted to talk a little bit about, or ask you a bit about this idea that the measure might not primarily target China, but is targeting overcapacity from Russia and the Middle East. I understand that that's an important source of overcapacity as well, but if China isn't, the primary target of the measure, do you think that this Section 232 measure can address the main issue, or does it need to be done in tandem with some other kinds of measures, perhaps, as well? And then, secondly, what do you think about country exclusions? Canada, NATO allies, what are your views on that? Thank you.
Thanks for the question. First and foremost, as I said, we do believe that China remains the most significant problem. And we do absolutely support targeted actions. Perhaps you're referring to the WTO case. But I think Tom Conway used the word languishing at the WTO. It was filed just about a year ago now, actually, sitting here, almost to the day, I suppose, as we're sitting here. And little progress has been made while the industry has continued to suffer. So we absolutely do support it, but we do believe that a comprehensive solution is required, only because targeting China alone is not going to solve the problem. The problem has to be solved on a much broader basis. The second part of your question, in order to be effective, these actions do in fact need to be comprehensive and widespread. That having been said, picking up on what the General said, we do believe that, consistent with the objective of maintaining safe and secure supply to the U.S., and of course considering those producing regions that aren't principally controlled by state-owned actors, Canada, for example, is an obvious target for special consideration, we do believe. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having this. Will Malden with the Wall Street Journal. I wanted to ask, among all of you here, is there any doubt that the administration would find in its report the need to do something to restrict aluminum imports through the 232? Is there any doubt that the president would take action on that for aluminum as well as steel? Some of you work with the steel industry as well. Would be interesting if there's any significant doubt that the administration will move forward, or if this is pretty much baked in. And also just wanted to follow up a little bit on Anna's question, perhaps with General Adams. You know, the national security strategy that came out of the White House seems to target Russia and China pretty specifically. You talked about concerned about supply chains heading to Russia and China. And you all have mentioned Canada, of course, as a neighbor and ally with a very integrated industry, but there are plenty of other sources of aluminum, and in the steel cases, steel that are U.S. allies. What kind of message is that sending to them when, you have some of the same countries who are in line for the F-35s, happy to take those from the U.S. Why wouldn't we be happy to take aluminum or steel from those allies?
Okay, I'm gonna, on the first part of the question, I have serious doubts about what's gonna happen because the story we were told was we're gonna do this quickly and this is gonna happen very swift and we're gonna solve this problem, and it just continues to drag out. And so we appreciate the 232 device to be able to look at national security and look at the rest of it, because it's not, when we're running a plant and a couple of pot lines, that whole book of business is not national defense. What builds under that and what allows that plant to run and sort of covers the overhead is the other business. And so if you're going to restrict primary aluminum, everything else is going to suffer along with it. And that's why this needs to be a broad solution. And we are worried, our union is worried that it's been a lot of talk and not much action. I mean, we've seen the administration pull back on the TPP, which was largely dead. And there's been a few other odds and ends, and we appreciate this self-initiation finally on the aluminum case. But we haven't seen a lot of action. And so, these deadlines are coming, and then there's a 90-day period. Who knows what's going to happen during that? And there are a lot of loud voices on the other side who think this shouldn't happen. And why that goes on in the country just mystifies us, that when you can see what 3 decades of failed trade policy has done to America's manufacturing base is just sort of mystifying. And look, when it comes to Canada, we think this opportunity ought to be used to identify problems, and there are problems, major ones in China and in Russia and the Middle East. But when you think of cheap, dumped, or subsidized steel or aluminum coming into the country, Canada doesn't leap to your mind. It's not bad labor standards in Canada. There's not lack environmental standards. We know the Canadians. We represent Canadians making these materials, and their packages are as good as the one in Century. So it's not that Canada is putting the U.S. at a competitive disadvantage, but when you're making aluminum and paying someone $4 a day in China as opposed to $20 an hour here, that's what we're struggling with, and that's what the country has to come to terms with.
If I can address the second part of the question briefly. There's 2 issues here. One is our efforts are designed to uphold and strengthen our defense industrial base, and notably for this purpose, our aluminum industry. They're not directed at any particular country, although it's without question that China and Russia are violators of the rules of free trade. Because they don't play on this level playing field. But our real interest, our outcome that we want, is a secure, quality supply of primary aluminum in the United States. And everything else is at risk. We control our supply. We control our own supply chains. We don't control supply chains from other countries. Some countries are more risk than others, no question about it, and we have to conduct that risk evaluation as we go through this. But our objective is the strengthening of our defense industrial base, in this context, our own primary aluminum industry.
Hi, thank you for being here. Isabel Hoagland with Inside U.S. Trade. I'm interested in hearing your thoughts, Mr. Bless and everybody else. In November, the Commerce Department self-initiated a case into aluminum sheet from China. And Mr. Bless, you said earlier that the 232 could be the best and last opportunity to bring the industry back to where it needs to be. Are you prioritizing the 232 tool over potential remedies that could result from that? and the case at the WTO. Are you planning on propping up that WTO case into aluminum subsidies at all? And then 2 more questions. Has the aluminum industry seen a spike in imports since the 232 initiation, similar to what the steel industry is saying? And lastly, what are you all expecting this month? Will the report be made public, or are you just expecting an announcement that it will be delivered to the White House?
May I take the second and first, and I'll leave to one of my colleagues the third question. So the second is quite easy. The answer is yes. Chinese aluminum exports this year will hit a record high of close to 5 million tons. They're expected to increase at least another 10% next year. So the answer to that one is a factual absolute yes. That's from U.S. Customs. That's from reported data. On the first, as we've said, this is the 232 that the president initiated in April, and the one that we're here to talk about today relates to primary aluminum. Obviously, the sheet action is something different. Our contention, strong contention, is that without a vibrant primary aluminum industry, the rest of the downstream industry, obviously, in the U.S. is going to suffer because there will be no indigenous U.S.-born prime to fuel the rest of the downstream products, be the DoD-oriented or otherwise. So as I said, we absolutely support the WTO case, and we'll do everything we can to help. But this action here is this 232 that we're here to talk about relates to primary aluminum. And on the timing and the rest, I guess I'd leave that to Tom or somebody.
We don't know what's going to happen. No, I don't. Nobody knows what's going to happen around here anymore. Look, this case was initiated, this 232 was announced in April. And during that period of time, Secretary Ross has done a lot of other interagency discussion. There's been a lot of input. People on both sides of this story have weighed in. It's been talked to death. So we're hoping that when the cases get turned over to the White House on the 15th and the 22nd, that within days, it's acted on. And that another 90-day period of either public discussion or just sitting on it for the sake of sitting on it doesn't do us any good. There is damage occurring now that needs to get taken care of. So sitting and waiting on this serves no purpose and certainly doesn't serve the American workforce or these companies. So we think when the president gets it, time's up. He should do something with it.
And let me just ask one more question to you, Tom, and we'll come back to you, General, real quickly. Obviously, we've seen a raft of trade remedy cases in steel and aluminum. Steel can cover 20-plus countries, 30-plus countries around the world in multiple different products. We've seen global forums, we've seen OECD negotiations, and yet these problems persist. In your mind, does that point to the need for a broader, more comprehensive solution?
Look, I think you can talk about this forever and ever and ever, and until you have some sort of a hard and fast device, a number, a tariff, a quota, something where you're going to finally put your foot down and say, no, we're not going to accept that anymore. People are good at getting engaged in discussions and dialogue, and so either through the Global Forum, through the OECD, years and years and years of discussion, people's unwillingness to even tell you how much they're making, and there's just a lot of gamesmanship with it. America shouldn't be naive about that, and you can talk yourself to death in this city and anywhere else. So I think you need something hard and fixed that you stand by, that you're going to put in place to preserve your own ability to both preserve your markets. Why give up your own market? And while this dialogue goes on, I mean, it's just a foolish approach, and now risk your ability to have a national defense. I mean, if you're the general, I'm a veteran too, and I've done a lot of work on aircraft through my career. The idea to think that you would need to source aluminum from Russia or China for your Air Force or your Navy or your missile defense is, to me, it's staggering why you could even find yourself in that discussion in this country. But we are there. And I think it's nonsense. It's got to get dealt with.
And we'll ask the general to speak real quickly, and one final comment from Speaker Gingrich, and then we'll wrap up our questions.
I just want to say we need to nest this discussion in strategy. It's not an isolated issue. It is an issue across our defense industrial base, and in fact, in the latest national security documents, we start to link economic security with national security. These are the right linkages. And there was a comment earlier, are we concerned about the outcome of the 232? Absolutely. That's why we're here. That's why we're not having Bloody Marys at this time of the day. But it certainly is the case. To use a sports metaphor, this is the next series of downs. There's a fight, a strategic fight that's going on that we need to open our eyes to. Defense industrial base, the health of our economy, aluminum is a huge part of that, but it's much broader than that across the board. Thank you.
And Speaker Gingrich, any final comments?
Yeah, look, I think there are three really important takeaways about where we are. The first is, across the board, we have to have a much more aggressive effort to define what a defense industrial base is in the modern era, and to ensure that we sustain inside the United States the capacity, if we have to surge, to be able to wage war without relying on our opponents to be primary providers. Second, I think this question about state-subsidized and state-supported industries is true across the board. It's true in the airline industry. It's true in aluminum. You just go down a whole list of things. We do not today have an adequately aggressive analysis system to say, look, this country is giving a 45% advantage to its particular industry, and therefore we should have a countervailing 45% penalty for that particular industry coming. And that begins to be country specific, not generic to the whole world. And third, I think China will be, and you have to give them some credit. This is, I'm not complaining about it, I'm just saying as a matter of fact, China will be a permanent, unique player in the world market because it is going to be bigger, better organized, more methodical, and with a long-term strategy. And we had better be prepared to operate at the same tempo and with the same toughness and the same sophistication as the Chinese. So those are my three big takeaways. I thought this was a very good, very smart panel, and I'm really honored that you allowed me to participate.
Thank you. And Mike, any? Okay.
Thank you to the speaker and the others.
And just some of our panelists will be available afterwards for media questions or sit downs. There's a lot of reporters in the room, so we're happy to make them available. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bloody Mary time.
On John.
Yeah.
We're done.